So I was in Ireland recently, and I didn't expect, as I was learning about the history and methodology of British imperialism on that island, how much clarity and context it would give me on how the American Empire worked. Specifically, something I learned was I feel like one of the reasons why the American Empire has been able to come out on top and be like relatively stable compared to other empires is because of how it's able to mask its own oppression, as well as like exploit sectarian violence between people who are oppressed. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. Let me just give some context about what I'm talking about. I'm going to use Northern Ireland as an example just to show you what I'm talking about. So these are the walls of Derry, or Londonderry as it's also known. Yes, this is also the place that the show Derry Girls is based off of. So British and Scottish settlers came to Northern Ireland in the 1600s to like make plantations. And one of the first things they did in Derry was build this wall. And the purpose of this wall was basically to separate the non-Irish like plantation and property owners from the local Irish people. This was already something that had clear precedence in Irish history, like British Protestants coming to the land, farming it, building plantations, but explicitly excluding Irish people, and then being connected to the crown back home. So sending supplies and resources to the British crown and receiving military support. In case the local Irish people got unruly at not having access to any fruits of the labor that British settlerism was getting from building these plantations. So this continued for several hundred years. This is the view from the walls to the outside. So this is actually like the Bogside neighborhood right here, which is like traditionally a poor working class neighborhood. You can see they have a cathedral because they're Catholic historically, not Protestant, which the British were. Though there were tensions and some conflict naturally because of the separation, generally the Unionists, which were the like Protestant minority who had British and Scottish heritage, were able to keep their control of the city of Derry politically and economically. One of the primary ways they did this was gerrymandering, and there were a lot of other strategies that I won't really go into. But basically, tensions started to raise a little bit more in the 1900s because of the World Wars and also because of Irish independence, which applied to everywhere in Ireland except for Northern Ireland, which Derry is in Northern Ireland. But the way that the Unionists in power reacted to this, again, the Unionists had a connection to the British Crown, was they like continued to push out and militarize Derry. Like Irish Catholic unemployment was so high in Derry, and yet the British did not give them any jobs, did not give them any access to their industries, refused to give them education, any resources or anything. This podcast I was listening to was talking about like how a lot of militant Irish nationalists kind of became militant because they had no jobs and they had nothing to do. And so because they had nothing to do, they kind of just started fucking with the British police and the Unionists in the city. But the Unionists continued to crack down on the Irish Catholic majority to the point where in 1971 they established internment without trial, which basically meant that they could take and detain any Irish Catholic person without any reason at all. All of these factors led to like a civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, which was inspired by the civil rights movement in America, a response to Jim Crow and segregation. But then during this nonviolent march, British police opened fire on unarmed protesters and shot 26 of them, killing 14 of them. This came to be known as Bloody Sunday, which many identify as the start of the Troubles, which if you've heard of that are like these decades of violent guerrilla warfare between Irish nationalists and British loyalists in power. The reason I bring all of this up and provide all this context is because one thing I noticed when looking at all of this history is how the British people literally created the conditions for a violent Irish resistance. Like they segregated them from day one, they enacted violence, they suppressed them, they didn't give them jobs, and they literally killed nonviolent protesters. This is also largely the history of America. I mean, our founding fathers literally descended from the British, right? And we came to this country and we massacred the native people and we enslaved black people. And this was all there from day one, but you'll notice as these struggles boiled up and resulted in social movements, in violence, in literal wars, that America slowly learned how to adapt. Like, okay, rather than have explicit slavery, let's write the 13th Amendment, which allows us to arrest and incarcerate anyone we want and put them to work, but also gives us ambiguity that we can hide behind. And after Jim Crow and segregation, okay, we enact that everyone is equal under the law, but we don't undo any of the oppression that had been done, and we still allow white supremacy to exist under the cracks, and we protect white people's property and their wealth, even if that property and wealth was due to oppressive systems like slavery and like Jim Crow, and even if their property came from the massacre of native people on this land. This is the primary difference I noticed between America and the UK, is that America adapted. America learned kind of smartly that if you explicitly oppress people, they will eventually fight back. But if you obscure these systems of oppression behind these ambiguous laws that really could go either way, but in practice end up maintaining oppression, then that allows you to evade accountability and basically gaslight people of color. That is one skill that I truly, truly believe every white person who grows up in modern day America learns, is how to obscure their oppression. It's how to do things that end up being oppressive and end up correlating with injustice, right? Like white people on average have more wealth, they have more property, but there's nowhere in the law that says white people need to have more wealth and more property, right? And it allows people to gaslight the oppressed into believing like, oh, this is just a matter of my own individual skill and my own individual freedom. I'm the reason I'm not rich. I just need to work harder. That and pitting minorities against each other, it's a recipe for success, honestly. It's not that minorities are freer in America than they are anywhere else. It's that they think they're freer, and that's what gives America the upper hand.